The Austrian Empire, a land facing the challenges of a world that is quickly moving into a new era, an era which promises to leave places like Austria behind. The Habsburg monarchy is one on the verge of dissolution if it can't adapt, and the main driver of that dissolution is nationalism. While in 1836, the widesweeping nationalism of the springtime of nations hasn't yet hit Austria, the tension can be felt in the urban centers of the constituent peoples that call this empire home. In Prague, Milan, Krakow, and Pest, militant nationalists organize and spread their ideology throughout the countryside, all seeking autonomy or independence. Even in Vienna, the idea of a German state made for Germans has infected the people, and these German nationalists may yet be the most dangerous dissidents of the bunch. Thus remains the real question of any Austrian campaign: are the Habsburgs really necessary to maintain the empire? Although it's a long way off, and nationalism is the popular ideology for now, there will, in good time, rise new ideologies that could redefine Austrian identity for better or worse. In today's video, we'll be guiding Austria through its most tumultuous period and finding it on the other end a changed country. Let's see what Austria is made of. Austria starts the game in a strong position, with potential for rebellious nationalists to disturb things, but ultimately a strong secret police force keeping them in line. Of course, the irrevocable march of nationalism will, in its time, pull all into its grasp. The simple answer might be to simply give more rights to those minorities, but the German supremacists might have a word about the dilution of their importance in the state. Of a more critical priority is the relationship with the crown lands of Hungary, Croatia, and Transylvania. In reality, Austria would partition its empire to appease the Hungarians rather soon, but for this playthrough, there will be no appeasement. Anyway, beyond all the politics, we're going to get to industrializing out in Bohemia, since it has a huge selection of natural resources and population to work it. Bohemia, however, is a Czech homeland, so there's fear that it might one day attempt a secession. Nonetheless, its industrial capability cannot be ignored. One thing that helps Austria significantly with building up their nation is the corvée labor that manorialism grants them. For each subsistence farm, they get 0.1% construction efficiency in that state. Given Bohemia has 189 subsistence farms, the entire state gets 18.9% construction efficiency. Very nice. In terms of tech, I'm going for a water tube boiler right away to really get the economy going, and then I had in mind to get pharmaceuticals, which would let me get healthcare and potentially help with any radical issues. But this was actually my first playthrough on Austria, back on the early access patch, so I didn't realize that when the Springtime of Nations comes, no amount of healthcare will keep it down. Nonetheless, we'll get there when we get there. For my first company, I made an armament syndicate, I Fabbricanti di Fucile Jacob, named after a channel member, of course. It's Italian for the Jacob gun fabricators, or just gun makers, really. I don't speak very good Italian, so there's probably a better way to say it, but I chose an Italian name because the HQ for the company is in Lombardy, and of course, the Italians are famous for their firearms. To encourage prosperity on the company, I'll be subventing small arms exports. In past patches, this was super good since there was an event for nations importing guns that would make them take infamy away from the nation they're buying the guns from, but that event was changed, and now there's less of a reason to be exporting guns. I'm doing it because I want the prestige guns and the company modifier to make future wars easier. Speaking of making wars easier, I'm also going to queue up some navies, and I know it's been a slow game so far, but things will pick up soon. The last piece of pre-game work is to pass a law, and I'll be passing legal guardianship just to appease the landowners and because I highly value birth rate in the early game. In my opinion, it's best to prioritize birth rate to start the game, then later, once labor is a genuine concern for your economy, you can start getting women's suffrage. Shortly into the game, Austria gets this Geheime Staatskonferenz modifier, which can work to either empower or disempower the landowners. It is, all the same, a crippling modifier if you're looking to reform the nation, given it reduces the success chance on all law passes. Anyway, let's actually let the game run a bit now. We can see that in the summer of 1838, the clear problem child of the Crown lands is Hungary, and I want to again emphasize that I didn't at the time, nor even now really, know exactly how the different paths of Austria's potential future worked. I also didn't know that if during literally any of the Hungarian rebellion events, which might soon fire, you choose to oppose them, you get to just annex them for zero infamy. See, I was thinking it would be a waste of money to fight Hungary, so I would try to appease them, believing that I wouldn't get anything out of a rebellion. I want to be very clear that if you don't intend on creating a dual or triple monarchy as Austria, just put Hungary down. In June of 1839, I put the ideological truth mandate into my power block since I find its max level bonus, the minimum 25 legitimacy, to be pretty good for doing fun stuff with laws. Just a few months later, in August, I granted Hungary personal union status and then a bunch of privileges like exemption from service, regime support, and knowledge sharing. It means they're no longer totally disloyal, but it was very unnecessary to do this, and it also hurts a lot because Hungary as a personal union pays no dues, unlike a crown land. The following year began the Hungry 40s, which is meant to be a time of mass starvation, but in truth I barely felt its effects, mostly because my nation is still largely a bunch of peasants. The peasants don't care as much if grain prices spike. One nice bonus of making Hungary a personal union is that since they're no longer a crown land, I can incorporate the other crown lands of Croatia and Transylvania, which I did in September of 1840. Nonetheless, this Hungarian personal union is having liberty desire issues, which is unfortunate. I'll have to beef up my army to fix it, but I don't want to take on the expense if I can avoid it. In a few more years, the Springtime of Nations will be beginning, and I haven't quite gotten my secret police leveled up enough to keep me safe. Meanwhile, the Prussians are off solving the Schleswig-Holstein question, and I just can't quite get my munitions company to be prosperous. It's tough with weapons, although I could double down on the subventions, of course. In better news, I got another power block mandate in August of 1842, and I've got pretty much all of Italy in my power block. The Austrian Empire had her first war in April of 1843, a welcome sight for the munitions industry. A Serbian uprising heralds the potential future for Austria, as the Ottoman Empire is coming apart under the weight of its own grandeur. In the case of the Ottomans, their foreignness is significantly more impactful than Austria's, who can at least share in their ethnicity with their subjects. In terms of gameplay, this is significant, as most of Austria's pops will be second-class citizens only, instead of the Ottomans who have to deal with the cultural erasure or open prejudice status. Anyway, I joined the Serbian Separatist War, asking that the Separatists become my protectorate, which was dumb, since they'll just join Serbia and won't actually be my subject, but this will weaken the Ottomans all the same, which is in my interest, of course. I was smart, though, in that I joined Greece's war against the Ottomans and asked to transfer Serbia to me as a war goal. By transferring Serbia while they're small, I pay little infamy, but when the Separatists join them, I don't have to pay any extra infamy to get all that land. Very nice. During the war, the Austrian soldiers realized the trouble of working with comrades that don't speak German, and so some progress towards a South German supremacist movement was brewing. German national identity was coalescing and taking the spotlight away from the Habsburg crown. In reciprocity, did the non-German Austrians see that soon they'd either gain their independence or remain a repressed people in this empire that won't compromise, and so began the Springtime of Nations across Europe, a radical movement seeking to create ethnostates in Europe and to dismantle the absolute monarchies of old. Shortly after, the Ottomans surrendered their war, and so Austria can bask in her glory with a military parade, but it might make her complacent to the rising radicalism of the empire's minorities. In the conflict of Austria's identity, there is a very clear path of the old, the monarch, ruling without limit to make the land what he will. This movement is spearheaded by Herr Metternich and the Catholic Church. On the other side is a nation ruled from the bottom up, and centered on the identity of its people. Austrian identity is Habsburg identity for the time being, but a lot of people no longer agree. In September of 1844, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret police of Austria, which does in fact share a name with the Gestapo of World War II Germany, arrested a radical in charge of the intelligentsia, and in his place came a market liberal, which, although not optimal, was acceptable enough for now. This should give you an idea of how we'll be handling these radicals that seek to end the empire. In terms of technology, I'm queuing up a bunch of society techs, and you can see me eyeing up that corporatism tech. I'm thinking about that reduction of radicals from political movements, but that tech will also unlock our path towards the fascist, or rather, federal state of Austria. Checking in on the Fabbricanti di Fucile Jacob in January of 1845, we see it's still struggling to get any prosperity, especially with the end of the war, and I fear I might have made it harder by giving them trade rights. I was hoping they'd be able to make more buildings with trade rights and thus increase their prosperity, but it might be cutting their productivity enough to make it not really helpful. A radical started making some noise in Vienna, a German businessman, Theophil Exter, and his impassioned speeches and shrewd evasion of the secret police led to an emboldening of the political aims of Austria's radical movement. Seizing the opportunity, the Poles of Galicia took the initiative to begin their insurrection. They refused to pay taxes, kids skipped school to load and stockpile weapons, and the secret police had to sort through all kinds of false information coming in from their informants. The revolutions are beginning. Seeing the Poles rise up, the Romanians of the former Crown Land of Transylvania engaged in similar behavior, and then the Czechs. All at once, the minorities that have supplied Austria with her strength are uniting to overthrow her. Meanwhile, German supremacists in Vienna see this as justification to finally completely demote these minorities to enemies of the empire. And I will say here, I wanted to pass national supremacy to really simulate that supremacist vibe, but I just can't do it. As a European, racial segregation is way too good, and I didn't want to throw this one away with bad choices, especially considering how much national supremacy would upset the rebels. Oh, and in case things weren't bad enough, the Prussians made their move to assume leadership of the German Confederation from Austria. As the Austrian army was just gearing up to fight separatists, they had to pack up and march to the Sudetenland, Bavaria, and Saxony to prepare for battle with their German brothers. Seeing the regiments leaving their cities, the Poles properly rose up, proclaiming some distant relative of the Piast dynasty their king, despite their having died out a century ago. I wish, by the way, that radical separatists like these would have republican governments, as was historical for the time. Right now, these Polish separatists are monarchists with a secret police and subject to citizenship laws, making them in essence just another Austria. This should really be a national supremacy republic with universal suffrage maybe, although I'd take autocracy for the revolutionary period, I guess. Nonetheless, the Poles have no chance, as the Russians joined Austria in the assault on the separatists, whose radicalism might have otherwise inspired the Russian Poles to rise up too. Meanwhile, the Austrian army was trying its best against Prussia, whose army was significantly better equipped and trained. Sure, the Austrians were veterans of a recent war with the Turks, but that war was barely anything at all, while the Prussians had been drilling and preparing for the war with the likes of France for some time now. Nonetheless, the real breakpoint of the government in the face of Prussian aggression and Polish separation is the budget and the bureaucracy. Guns aren't cheap, and of course the Italian gunsmiths of Lombardy are looking to make some more money on this war. Maybe privatizing the military industry wasn't so wise. Anyway, the Poles were defeated mostly by Russia in August of 1846, at which point I got the war crimes event, which I hate so much. I said it in my review, but this event, if you're taking something like 50 infamy, should really cause some kind of devastation or death, or at least some displacement in Poland. You can't give a modifier like terrified dissidents with zero problems for the dissidents in question. Some commenters on the review mentioned that local laws in Europe might not allow the depiction of certain things like the Armenian genocide. Brother, I'm not saying we need an Armenian genocide journal entry or something, or like mention even of the big bad G word at all in the game. Just put some devastation to Poland, lower cultural acceptance maybe at least. In my world, we'd see some displacement of pops into neighboring nations, or perhaps even some death, maybe. I don't know why we tiptoe around this tragic but nonetheless real history. If it's about local laws or whatever, which I don't really believe, but okay, then just keep it nice and vague. I mean, come on guys. We have the Trail of Tears in the game, which I'm happy to see represented since that history should not be forgotten or glossed over, but whatever, rant over, back to the game. A myriad of other separatists started their insurrections, and facing total collapse and little additional problems from the Prussians, Austria capitulated the war, allowing Prussia to take over the German Confederation. Meanwhile, the army went over to Greece shortly to put down some rebels there in return for Greek subjugation, and that war was fast enough that the army could return home before any new rebellions began. Thankfully, the radicalism of the other movements was stunted by the failure of the Poles and the radical fervor of the springtime of the peoples. The revolution was vanquished in September of 1847, 1 year before they began in real life. With that, Austria will probably never face another secession ever again, because nationalism is still a pretty weak mechanic in game, but it was fun while it lasted. As all the Austrian subjects returned to regular life, realizing things aren't really so bad, the government focused in on passing race segregation once more, which they succeeded with in July of 1848. This won't really change much, but it will result in less tolerance for most of the non-Germans in their homelands, and an increase in tolerance for non-Germans outside their homelands, but only by a marginal degree. I guess it can best be described as a standardization of citizenship laws, where the local laws of each section of the empire, which would favor particular cultures that were native to the region, were replaced by a set of laws which would be applied equally across the empire. That all being said, most Pops live in their homelands in Austria, so this is mostly a downgrade in tolerance on average. By the way, since I've got an ideological union, I can enforce regime changes on my power block members, and it turns out we do have some nations that are breaking from the authoritarian monarchist ways of the Metternich system. The most egregious example is of course the Pope. It might sound strange, but the Emperor is the ultimate authority on earth, and although the Catholic Church matters, the Pope cannot be seen as an equal. In something of an unprecedented change in the interpretation of the divine right of kings, it was decided to demote the Pope and put a king in charge of Rome. Of course, because Victoria III is weird, what this actually results in is the Pope simply becoming the King of Rome, but I like to think that this move is instead about asserting the Austrian Emperor's primacy and power over even the Vatican, whose authority has long been outside the people's minds in Europe. The promotion of the Emperor over the Pope was the last major influence the Herr Metternich had on the empire before his retirement, which came about at the turn of 1850. Metternich worked to maintain the power of the Habsburg monarchy, and in so doing was quite successful, I'd say. Austria briefly had some tough times with its separatists, but was able to keep the minorities in line and even please the German national liberals without too much cost to the crown. The economy has grown quite a bit thanks to the corvée labor emblematic of this traditional empire, but Metternich can't help but see that Austria's future will be one of change, eventually. He held back the flood of reform that has in recent decades swept Europe off its feet, but now that Ferdinand von Habsburg has abdicated to his heir Franz Josef, Metternich is no longer needed. His retirement has left a legacy of aristocratic gallantry for Austria, but one which will surely fade one day in the face of unstoppable change. Somehow, Austria has managed to avoid most of these changes, conceding only its views on citizenship. Metternich's retirement from Austrian politics is very much so a retirement of the old order, as the new Archduke Franz Josef is more aligned with the German liberals of the petite bourgeoisie than the old money Austrian aristocracy. Essentially, the work put in to prevent the violent overthrow of Austria by Metternich will be used by this young man to create a modern and moderate Austria. That begins with the end of manorialism, which although useful for the extra construction labor, is ultimately a form of serfdom which holds the nation back. The idea of a modernizing Austria is attracting all sorts of would-be political revolutionaries, one such man being Faustino del Ribeiro, an industrialist from Latin America that wants to see suffrage come to Austria. His ambitions may yet come to pass, but for now he'll be allowed by the Archduke to spread the idea around Vienna and get people interested. Looking at Bohemia here in July of 1850, you can see that it's been built up pretty significantly by now, although there are still 500,000 peasants waiting for work. The construction industry is a self-feeding system of resource extraction, tool and steel manufacturing, and job-making endeavors, which can carry an entire economy. The resources are sold for profits to the manufacturers, who also make profits, and the workers that make wages there pay taxes that pay for the goods. In theory, a perfect system, although of course it can be expensive on the budget. In other news, bringing Switzerland into the ideological union, a democratic republic, has weakened the power bloc significantly, resulting in several members just leaving, which is kind of funny in a way. Obviously it would be best to just kick Switzerland out, but instead I want to let this simulate Italy's aspirations for unification and Austria's withdrawal into itself looking for reform. In terms of the building queue, you probably have noticed all the universities in the top right, and yes, I am spamming them because I want research speed, and although the budget is kind of concerning, it's really not so bad. Once we get onto tenant farmers, we can probably get laissez-faire pretty easily and create a booming private economy. Tenant farmers is passing pretty slowly, but it's only thanks to the ideological truth power bloc mandate giving me a minimum of 25 legitimacy that I can even form a government that wants this. I find ideological truth to be really fun because it lets you do nonsensical governments like this coalition of industrialists, intelligentsia, petite bourgeoisie, farmers, and proletariats. It's essentially just everyone against the old order of Austria, the greatest unification of the classes ever seen, really. Bavaria had a radical revolution in June of 1851, and they accepted to become a protectorate in return for support, which is nice, although I suspect Germany will be doing a unification play in the near future that will render the subjugation of Bavaria quite pointless. In preparation for potential hostilities, I got an alliance with the British in return for mutual trade privileges, which is pretty nice. Having a British alliance should secure us against any possible invasions or civil wars even, and it will also reduce liberty desire in our subjects. To celebrate the new trade opportunities afforded by the British, I founded a new company, one of the new ones, the Witkowitzer Bergbau- und Hudengewerkschaft, which is a mining company that gives bonuses to electricity and construction throughput. Not bad, to be honest. I of course renamed it to Das Bergwerk von Main-Loro, after our beloved channel member, Main-Loro. Sorry if the German there is wrong, I believe a bergwerk is a mountain work, or a mine, to be more succinct. German can be logical like that. So this is essentially Main-Loro's mine, if translated. Regardless, Austria's political incoherence, guided by the ideological truth of the old Metternich system, has seen the abolition of serfdom in January 1853. Corvée labor be gone, although I will miss it. Now that the people are free to not work if they want to, we of course have to get in some anti-strike laws. Serfs can't strike, but free peasants sure can. The guild system is pretty bad because it reduces qualifications and forces buildings to have local owners, which isn't the worst thing ever, but it does reduce your investment pool. With anti-strike laws, we're not quite banning all unions like the Combination Acts would, but we're also just not letting people join unions willy-nilly. These laws ultimately don't have a huge impact, but the guild system does lock off laissez-faire, and is itself a bad law, so anything else is good. Check out the liberty desire on our subjects by May of 1853. Everyone is reined in, but again I should mention that I handled Hungary very poorly this run. If you don't make them a personal union, they'll eventually want you to make compromises, and if you just refuse them every time, you can annex them for no infamy via an easy war. Unfortunately, I didn't know that. We also hit 100 prosperity, finally, on the arms industry around this time, but of course I don't produce enough guns to get the prestige goods, so that'll take a little while. By the way, you'll find this interesting if you're a German historical nerd. In October 1853, we can see the Germans have fully annexed Denmark into the Confederation, and historically speaking, this was an idea. One solution to the Schleswig-Holstein question was indeed to just declare the Danes to be Germans and welcome them to the German Confederation, but of course they're too linguistically and historically different from the Germans for that to really be justified, and their own political aims wouldn't have likely aligned with the other Germans. Nonetheless, the Germany of this Victoria III has seen fit to declare Danes Germans and bring them into the Confederation of North Germany. Unfortunately, despite how cool that was to look at, there's an Italian play for leadership going on, and I've been forced to defend Rome while Russia is supporting the two Sicilies. That puts us at odds, but I don't want to be at odds with Russia, so I chose to reload the game and just annul the treaty with Rome rather than face Russia. Our current budget wouldn't do well with a mobilization, and we're focused on keeping the peace right now. If Italy wants to fight, let them fight. A similar conflict broke out between Sardinia-Piedmont and Lucca, where Russia and Germany would butt heads. Obviously, Germany will win that conflict, and I'm staying out of it. Instead of worrying about the geopolitics of Italy, I'm going to invite Orla Lehmann, a famous Danish Republican, and put him in charge of the rural folk. I'm not sure if I want to go with technocracy, or wealth voting, or census suffrage, but while I'm thinking about it, I'll be getting proportional taxation so I can maybe fix the budget. While waiting for that, our Italian arms manufacturers finally got to making high-powered small arms, although to be honest, I would have needed them against Germany, who by now I will probably no longer fight against. Nonetheless, prestige guns are very nice to have and should make wars much easier. With our new tax laws complete, I decided on census suffrage in February of 1858. It's time for liberalization, but with a light hand. Although the revolutionaries of the 1840s were put down, they will get what they had wanted all along. The enthusiasm for the new law was such that legislation was deemed unnecessary. Census suffrage was signed into a constitution, and the Kaiser of Austria entered parliament, ready to delegate his authority to a house of duly elected members of parliament. Austria, through moderate reform, is going from a nation stuck in the past to one at the forefront of innovation. But the real question is what role the Kaiser will play if he can't be the absolute monarch. This emperor, Franz Josef, is actually the Austrian emperor in real life that led Austria during the First World War, and his son, Rudolf here, entered a pact with his mistress to both end their lives, which they did, leaving Franz Josef without an heir. His brother, Karl Ludwig, was the presumptive heir, and then he died of typhoid fever, so Franz Josef's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, yes, the one you're thinking of, was the new heir. Crazy how a couple of inopportune deaths led to the immense events of World War I, although I'm sure had Franz Ferdinand not been Archduke, that some other event would have kicked off a great war. Regardless, yeah, kinda surreal to realize that the current Kaiser in-game is the one that will rule all the way to World War I in theory. Franz Josef took the throne when he was 18 and ruled until he was 86. That's an astonishing 58 years of rule. In this case, his rule might be a bit shorter, we'll have to see. The first election of Austria saw a victory for the Christian Social Party, but in close competition to the Progressive Club. It seems clear lines are being drawn between the conservatives of the church and aristocracy and the radicals of the trade unions and farmers led by Orla Lehmann. For now, I'll be working on getting dedicated police, which are overall a relatively popular institution, and the Kaiser will enjoy the extra free time afforded to him by the creation of a constitution. In September of 1860, there was a revolution in Krakow as the city sought freedom and the establishment of a Polish nation. Naturally, just one city cannot possibly fight off an entire empire, so the movement was swiftly crushed. After passing dedicated policing, the government got to work on a system of appointed bureaucrats. The crown land diet that had dominated Austria for so long has little place in a parliamentary system, and the power of the nobles must be undermined for the government to operate efficiently. Also, I want the tax capacity. In September of 1862, a new company entered the game of money-making. Erste Berliner Maschinenfabriksgesellschaft, the first Brno machine works business, in English terms, and it's a prestige engine company. We love to see those. I renamed it to Maschinenfabriksgesellschaft von Sulfi after our beloved channel member. It basically just means Sulfi's Machine Works, a very general name, but then again, General Motors is a thing, so sometimes a generic name is a great choice, right? While fighting off a Turkish separatist movement in Greece, the Germans did indeed go for their unification play, and I could maybe try to step in and stop them, but, well, I don't want to die, so I'll be allowing Germany to form. After all, if I can improve relations with the Germans, they might just be an even better and more reliable ally than the British. The Germans did very well against France and Bavaria, of course, with victory in sight as of January of 1864. Meanwhile, I'm thinking about some colonies. I need dyes and opium more than anything right now. I was thinking maybe of Haiti or parts of Africa, but those places didn't have both dyes and opium. You know what place does? Persia. In February of 1864, Kaiser Franz Josef called for the establishment of an Austrian overseas empire, with its first acquisition to be Persia. Thanks to the alliance with the British, keeping control of the shipping lanes to and from Persia shouldn't be too tough. For this war, I'll be biting a chunk out of Persia, and I don't intend to go too crazy on colonization. I just want a good source of rare plantation goods, which Fars, Isfahan, and Hormuz happen to have. Meanwhile, the rivalry between the Christian Democratic Party and the Radical Club seems to be at a head with the opening of the Spectre Haunting the World journal entry. The communists and socialists are looking to make a move, but they'll likely find their efforts squashed by the Austrian secret police and the federal police that were recently founded. Although I love secret police in-game, they do make communism basically vanish, which probably is too powerful. That being said, I like to think that the Kaiser creating a parliament and deboning himself without revolution was what kept the communists down, as the people just weren't very radical in the face of a constitutional monarch. It was especially difficult to revolt against a government promising public health care. Nonetheless, if the people couldn't get riled up enough, then the members of parliament could. The rural folk, as members of the Progressive Club, prepared a coup looking to overthrow the venerable Emperor Franz Josef. They want a republic, and they want it now. To appease the farmers, Franz Josef himself suggested a policy of economic protectionism, which the MPs seemed to nod along with. It's a good idea, royal assertion or not, and with the promise of a more protectionist economy, the farmers felt assured that their produce would make more profits and abandoned their coup attempt. Turns out, to stop a Republican coup, just put up some tariffs. Easy. In light of the lack of ideological leadership among the rural folk, the corporatist Julius Freud arrived in Vienna to begin the evangelization of an end to class war. The communists and the capitalists can be made to work together under the purview of a proper government like the Austrian parliament, and in good time, it's possible the government might transition from an authoritarian monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, and then to an authoritarian corporate state. But before that idea could really settle in, Austria was swept up in a new movement. The Gründerzeit has come at the turn of 1869, and with it has the German world been plunged into an economic craze. Banks are giving away loans at a pittance of an interest rate, and wealthy capitalists are using every penny they own to create more and more businesses. This is largely an effect of Germany's unification, but the Austrians too have been motivated by their acquisition of colonies off in Persia. There's a positive atmosphere to the German world, and so revolutions of any kind are off the table, at least for now. I'm sure most of you have heard by now about how the Gründerzeit is impossible to complete, and you may even have watched Generalist's video where he really gave it his best shot. It's true, the Gründerzeit is pretty much impossible unless you're Super Germany and you use conquest to spike your GDP, or if you manipulate your production methods to deflate and inflate your GDP as necessary. From what I understand, this journal is being reworked for a later patch, so things might get fixed up soon. Regardless, I didn't know all that at the time, so I went in hard for this journal. In my particular case, Germany has about double my GDP, so it would be especially hard for me to carry us in this little mini-game of economic growth. In case you don't know how it works, all German cultural nations are tasked with growing the total German GDP by 2.5% every 3 months. So, the journal checks the combined German and Austrian GDP when the journal starts, sets a target 2.5% higher, and if you hit it, then the bar either progresses or stays where it is if it's already full, otherwise you lose progress. The entire 30-year period for this journal, your capitalists and aristocrats invest more money into the investment pool and your interest rate is lower. If you fail, you get some negative investment modifiers and lose attraction to any interest group that supports free trade, also known as the industrialists. In order to try and succeed here, I pumped up the construction immensely, and you can see how this changed my GDP graph after just the first quarter, which we failed to succeed by the way. Unfortunately, Krakatoa then erupted while I was pursuing this immense economic growth, and of course, a massive volcano destroying the agricultural sector is unlikely to help with GDP growth. What's also not helping is that the German GDP graph isn't exactly impressive, but it could be worse, I guess. I was pretty close to getting at least 1 quarter of success in June that year, but alas, I failed again to carry our economies. Despite the total economic failure of the Gründerzeit, the Kaiser and Parliament journal entry completed and we gained the loyalty of the Austrian people. It's pretty nice to see. We will fail the Gründerzeit here, bringing the Age of Founders to an abrupt end, but that doesn't mean Austria can't still prosper. The government is working on a primary school curriculum, which might help the nation achieve greater literacy, and in terms of economic growth, well, things are still going very well, just not well enough to please the almighty journal entry. Diplomatically speaking, things aren't as good though. In September of 1870, the Italians were looking to unite and break free from Austrian hegemony. They unfortunately found support with the Germans and Russians. Thankfully, Britain and France came to Austria's aid, and thus we basically have a world war over Italian unification. Naturally, this war will be horrifically anticlimactic because the only war goals that can be pressed will see either Italy unite, or Modena, a tiny nation, being cut down to size. So what do you think? Can Germany and Russia defeat Austria, Britain, and France? Looking at the numbers on the fronts, it's not looking good for the Italian alliance, but my front with Germany and Russia is looking quite scary. Hopefully, my prestige firearms and defensive stance can make the difference in the war. In order to add some stakes, I put a war goal on Germany to get 132,000 pounds of income from them. I could maybe have conquered Silesia or something, but it's a lot of infamy and it would make the borders kinda ugly. The war began in January of 1871, and the fighting was indeed very ugly. Trench warfare isn't quite a thing yet, but immense shrapnel artillery and somewhat organized infantry companies sure are. This means that men, in tight-knit columns and rows, will be getting bombarded by immense shells from the skies, and they'll have nowhere to run for safety. My front line was initially having huge trouble, but as the French and Belgians on the Western Front pushed into Germany, the Germans were forced to send more men away. The front did stabilize around May that year, with Alsace-Lorraine occupied and the Germans feeling the weight of their military's cost, and the pain of their young men's deaths. After the Italians surrendered and had their capital occupied, the entire coalition force arrived to the German and Russian front, ready to push. The Germans have not yet tasted defeat, and now they must be made familiar with its bitterness. The Austrian army, in all its grandeur, flanked by French and British troops, marched through the German lines. Austrian sharpshooters worked to take out the artillery commanders pounding the front line with bombs, and French cavalry charged the lines, instilling fear into even the most disciplined Prussian officers. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy kept supply lines from America and Africa safe. The fighting in Silesia was bloody, but with almost 1 million total casualties, the Germans were willing to surrender. This war proved to be a great humiliation of Germany's great military legacy, as the Austrians lost less than 1/10 of the Germans in the war. However, Kaiser Franz Joseph did not seek to destroy or dismantle the German Empire. Instead, like siblings that fight viciously, he's hoping the two can make up and once again be friends like they were some decades ago. Germans should not be fighting. It'll take some time, but maybe German-Austrian relations can recover one day. With the war's end, the dream of Italian unification has been crushed, and the Germans have been crippled for the time being. Meanwhile, Austria's economy continues to boom, albeit there are fears of a government spending crisis. The parliament believes that by privatizing the agriculture of the nation and perhaps other aspects of society, the immense government spending of late can be rectified, but the patience of creditors is famously short. In an effort to secure funds for the government, the parliament looked up to the Kaiser. He has some money, doesn't he? Well, it's locked up in the crown lands of Hungary, he says. Very well, the Austrian government shall dissolve the crown land of Hungary then, and liquidate its assets. Although an extreme move, it felt necessary given the impending bankruptcy. Although loath to give up the title of King of Hungary, Kaiser Franz Joseph believed it best that Austria be consolidated, so he assented. Isn't there someone you forgot to ask, though? That's right, the Hungarian Diet of Nobles, who were none too pleased to see their land confiscated. War could have come to Austria, but the secret police, with a few well-placed assassinations, removed the roadblocks to Hungary's liquidation, and so Austria is united, just like that. I played this game on the early access patch, by the way, and in that patch, the matter of Hungary was a broken journal entry, so I can't resolve it by accepting the Hungarians. It'll just kind of be there forever, sadly. Regardless, you can see how much my credit limit jumps up in May of 1874. That's because all the Hungarian buildings now contribute their cash reserves to my credit limit, and once I incorporate those states, I'll even be able to collect taxes there. In order to get the Hungarians in line, the parliament made a controversial but necessary step in the right direction. It's time for multiculturalism in Austria, spurred on by the peace-mongering anarchists of Vienna, who argue that while Austria refuses to see her constituents as equals, there will always be problems. Maybe they're right, but all the other nonsense about abolishing the monarchy can certainly be thrown out the window. The farmers have especially been taken by the anarchist ideology of their recently chosen leader, and so the path to multiculturalism began. It won't be easy, but it will be possible. Also, if things don't go how I want, I can always save scum, but let's ignore that. By the way, check out the GDP graph in November 1874. Obviously, the huge jump is from integrating Hungary, but the slope of the line is still nearly vertical. It's scary to get over 800 construction points so suddenly, but boys, it's satisfying. In response to the push for multiculturalism, the noble officers of Austria, who were concerned by the very concept of a mixed ethnicity regiment, adopted a new ideology of military absolutism. The influence of these officers is comparatively low thanks to the legitimacy they have failed to secure in the national elections, but perhaps in the background they will scheme to stop this new Austria's ascension. The next handful of years saw mostly an uneventful series of debates over multiculturalism, with members of parliament arguing the merits and demerits of it, at times advancing or regressing, but on average certainly pushing the law forward. The Austrian budget, with the help of the Hungarian liquidation, was in recovery, and the economy continued to boom, especially with the help of German war operations. It was in June of 1877 that finally, the parliament drafted the Austrian Bill of Citizenship. They based their new concept of Austrian identity on service to the crown and the parliament. Any who enter Austria, and do so with the intention to work a job, make something of themselves, or otherwise contribute to the great nation, are welcome. Much of the symbolism of this new Austria was steeped in the glory of an empire characterized by diversity. Old histories and stories of oppression were repressed by the secret police, and replaced with narratives of tolerance and happiness. This is the sort of dystopian multiculturalism that would send shivers down the spine of anyone that seeks truth. The Austrian Empire was of course brutal to its minorities as recently as the 1840s, when the Poles were cruelly put down with Prussian help, and yet, children will be taught of the great love that Austria has always had for the Poles. The old veterans and survivors of the harsh years that Austria has had will remember, but they will soon pass away, either of old age, or of suspected treason, as the secret police have ears everywhere. Imagine a nation whose secret police execute you for failing to be tolerant enough. That is Austria, and there are elements of the society that simply cannot tolerate that. These administrators, who created the Austrian multicultural society, will become known as the founders, and this age, from the day that the Kaiser acceded to the founding of Parliament to the signing of the Austrian Citizenship Act, would be known as the Age of the Founders. From here, everything about Austrian society will change. There remain two subversive groups in this constitutional monarchy: the despot nationalists of the Conservative Party and the anarchists. The conservative mythos of Austria is as a nation defined by enlightened despotism, and they're led by Alexander von Bock, a famous Austrian authoritarian in real life who was responsible for much of the backlash from Hungary after his implementation of many authoritarian laws in the empire. On the other side, the anarchists, led by a non-historical guy, are also looking to end the monarchy. The Conservative Party is the most interesting player here, as they, of course, support the monarchy, but not this monarchy. The current Kaiser is an ineffectual one who has delegated away his power to instead spend his days at the summer or winter palaces of his choosing. He's not a worthy king. In essence, both parties want to see the current government fall, and so an unsteady alliance of anarchists and conservatives have come together to hopefully incite enough chaos that one or the other might come out successful. The two are obviously at odds ideologically, but while the parliament holds so much legitimacy, neither can get anywhere. I'm representing this subversion with the passing of Council Republic. In terms of why this particular law, well, I think it'd be the only law that could convince the anarchists and the conservatives to actually work together. I doubt the anarchists would accept just blanket autocracy or something, as it would even further their goals. No, a council republic, at least officially, will create at least some of the conditions necessary for an anarchist utopia. Of course, in that anarchy, Alexander von Bock fully intends to seize power for himself and mold a proper state out of it. You know, Metternich was right. The world is changing, and Austria will change with it. The change can't be stopped, but it can be guided at least. Anyway, while working on a council republic, the sitting government of Austria had the perfect distraction. A new positivist movement has swept the nation, putting atheism and rationalism at the forefront of the secret police's radar. Leaving the anarchists to be satisfied with multiculturalism and the conservatives to be natural supporters of the monarchy, the positivist movement was the only enemy of the state as far as they could tell. Nonetheless, the positivist stage has a lot of really good modifiers, so I'll actually be encouraging their growth as we go. It is what it is. With how much is supported the positivists, their journal entry actually completed within just a year and a half of it starting, which gives us some tech research speed, education access, and qualifications. We love to see it. Let's talk a little bit about the economy since we're in a period of slow political upheaval. I'm preparing an explosives industry as of summer of 1879, and we can see the GDP line is still quite amazing. It can be scary to go deep into debt, but you can see that over time, my budget has slowly improved to the point of now being positive. The Grundetzeit may have failed, but it at least got me to take the economy in the right direction. In September that year, we got explosives, and so the Austrian mining industry is about to, explode in both senses of the word. In December that year, I also got shift work, which will increase the throughput bonus on the larger industries, and that's going to be another bump in the economy, and from here, the true economic miracle of Austria will begin. In January of 1882, the GDP jumped up to £192 million, a massive increase since 1879, and that growth will only continue. I pumped construction up to over 1,500 points in September that year by swapping to steel construction, and with that, will the economy jump by another massive bound. Nonetheless, it was the parliament's focus on the economy that saw their enemies sneak up on them. From seemingly nowhere, the Austrian parliament was stormed and overtaken by anarchists and disgruntled military officers. A strange group for sure, but while Parliament was silent, held at gunpoint, the Baron Alexander von Bock entered the room and stood at the speaker's podium. He declared himself chairman of a workers' republic, barely able to get the word worker out of his mouth without wincing at the very idea. He took control of the parliament and told each MP that they could either vote in favor of this or find their parliamentary seat suddenly up for re-election due to some unfortunate circumstances. Naturally, the MPs either voted for the motion or were shot in their seats, and thus, the Kaiser and his monarchy were eradicated. Kaiser Franz Josef fled to Germany, where he'd likely live out his days with his son Rudolf in peace. There's no quarrel here, nor need to hunt down the monarch. Immediately after taking power, Alexander von Bock sat with his coalition of conservatives and anarchists to celebrate. Naturally, he'd spiked the drinks of his anarchist allies, and they all passed away before him. Ironically, the anarchists were without leadership, and without it they did scatter like some pests, and Alexander got to work on the bill to establish the federal state of Austria, the Standestaat. For those that don't know, the Standestaat is actually the government that's in charge of Austria at the beginning of Hearts of Iron 4. They were established in 1934, technically putting them in the period of Victoria III, if only by a few years. Standestaat is German for essentially corporate state or estate state, which is a more awkward translation, I'd say. The Standestaat in real life was something of a mix of Italian fascism and conservative Catholicism, essentially an authoritarian state centered on Catholic values and loyalty to the country. It's definitely an interesting, albeit short period for Austria, where it was ruled by the Fatherland Front, which is about as fascist as it sounds. What's interesting about it is that it actually wasn't Nazi-like, in the sense that it wasn't a German supremacist movement, but instead a Catholic supremacist movement. It was staunchly Austrian nationalist in the sense of being its own nation separate from Germany, and this actually explains why during the Anschluss it wasn't as simple as asking Austria to join Germany. The Germans had to do false elections and essentially coup the Austrian government out. I learned a lot about Austrian modern history from this video, let's just say. That aside, passing corporate state as a council republic is very easy because just about every interest group in the game dislikes council republics. Nonetheless, it won't be easy to avoid a civil war here, given the popularity of socialism among the people. Sure, the anarchist leaders are dead, but the people in the streets might still oppose the fascist movement, and worse, the minorities of the nation might fear their tolerance being rescinded under a fascist movement. Nonetheless, Alexander von Bach did emphasize, similarly to the real Fatherland Front, that the uniting factor of Austria is Catholicism first, and that the German ethnicity is not necessary to be a proper citizen of the state. There's a cool button for the Standestaat journal entry called Eliminate Parliament, which lets you just swap over to a single-party state in a coup, which I think is a really cool button to have. I wish I could have pressed it, but it required more legitimacy, and I had been using ideological truth to barely scrape by as it is. Examining the requirements for the journal, I'll need to get onto state religion, corporatized unions, single-party state, and of course corporate state. Shouldn't be too hard to do, although the more difficult thing will be getting all the socialist or radical interest groups to be marginalized. Unfortunately, the anarchists of the rural folk do still have quite a bit of power. Regardless, let your worries be assuaged by the beautiful GDP graph. As of October 1886, we're almost done passing corporate state, and the graph is looking like it might form a loop at this rate. Even the socialist movement, after having been suppressed for a while, has basically disappeared, and it seems as if the anarchists just can't organize one up to enforce their ideology on the nation, nor are they willing to, as detractors of conflict and war. The movement did crop back up again in November of 1887, but just a small movement in the countryside of Hungary and Romania. Even if they were to try and fight, they'd be easily destroyed. So long as the revolution doesn't somehow appear right in Vienna, nothing can stop the rise of the corporate state. Also, I should add that despite my best efforts to court the Germans, they just don't want to be friends, and then the British started some kind of war. I don't know, I was barely paying attention, and they called me in. So I thought, why not? This is a world where Britain and Austria work together to fight Germany and Russia every couple decades over pretty much nothing. Fun. Naturally, mine and Britain's armies are far too much for the German-Russian coalition, and by 1889, much of Germany and Western Russia has been occupied. Meanwhile, the socialists have risen up, but I mean, what a piddly little revolution. If it wasn't bad enough for them, both France and Belgium took my side against them, so yeah, this will just be a free clearing of many of my radicals. The Germans capitulated in May of 1889, and the war against Russia continued, but I didn't want to be involved in all that, so I just capitulated and focused on the socialists, who also capitulated just a few months later in August. With the socialists defeated and Germany humiliated once more, Alexander von Bach declared the federal state of Austria and announced a new age of enlightened despotism, tempered by Catholic ideals. The Standestaat has come. Although I'm asked to create a single-party state for the journal entry, I ended up focusing on technocracy first, and that's because I want to shake up my interest groups. I don't really want a petite bourgeoisie government, if I'm being honest, so as fun as it is to have Baron Alexander von Bach running his authoritarian dream state here, I'd like to maybe get an actual legitimate and actually useful interest group in charge, and I like the groups that technocracy tends to empower, as well as the free company slot that it gives as of the newest patch. In response to the passing of technocracy and the passage of multiculturalism from ages ago now, the German national liberals began to revolt. This could be considered a vestige of the old monarchist government in a way, albeit one evolved to suit the post-monarchy era. Now, it turns out that as a faction which once held the reins of government, they understand how, truly, to destroy a nation. It's to attack its economy. They have a plan, which will become clear soon. Aside from that, Alexander von Bach did what he could to hold back the national liberals and their false monarch, but his old age caught up to him, and he passed away in November of 1891. In his place has come Karl Lueger, and I had no idea who this guy was, so I looked him up. He's an old mayor of Vienna, but perhaps more infamously so. I'm just going to put up this little snippet from Wikipedia. It should be noted that he carries a legacy of actually developing Vienna into a metropolitan city, and he did good things for the capital, but he was also, very much so, a product of his time, and an inspiration for later products of later times. So you know, interesting. Anyway, shortly after Lueger's acquisition of the Austrian presidency, the German liberals made their move and started a civil war based in Vienna. Now, this is the crux of their strategy. The capital has been temporarily moved to Bohemia. However, Bohemia is now isolated from the entire empire, and thus shall my economy completely collapse. Just before the war's beginning, I had about 400 million pounds of GDP. Shall we enjoy watching it tumble to hell? I could have reloaded a save and moved my market capital to Budapest or something maybe to prevent this, but part of me kind of enjoys the challenge this presents. The thing about an isolated state in the market is that if this market capital is isolated, as it is right now, then no states in the entire empire can trade with each other. So suddenly, every state is its own entirely local economy. Obviously, I've been relying on the movement of goods to and from various states across the empire to maintain my economy, as any reasonable player would do, so this is a disaster. By September of 1892, the GDP has fallen below 100 million, and bankruptcy is just around the corner. Nonetheless, I've got British and French support in this war, so it should be an easy victory. Indeed it was, as the British and French armies carried me, and this civil war ended in January of 1893. A victory, but for no one really. The nation is in shambles after this war. Although the market is reunified, it'll take a long time for the economy to return to some kind of stability, and of course the government is defaulting on its loans. Thankfully, the default will be fixed by the return of the market's continuity. As the GDP returns to its old heights, it will give me more credit limit and fix the loan issue. By July of 1893, I've just passed technocracy, and I've got 200 million pounds of GDP, about half of what I had before the war began. With technocracy, I got a new company slot. Very exciting. I used it for the Elso Budapesti Gozmalom, which is such an obscure company that its Wikipedia article has no English translation. Looks like Google Translate says it means the old steam mill of the first Budapest steam mill company, which, seems legit. I know Hungarian to be a very complex language, so I can believe it. Regardless, this company has prestige grain on it, and it gives huge wheat farm throughput and trade advantage bonuses. It seems pretty good to me, and considering the Danubian plains have a lot of wheat growing, and a river, and agricultural throughput bonuses, this seems like it could be a really, truly amazing company. In charge of this company is Valentin Schaff, a moderate industrialist with nothing interesting going on. I renamed the company to Pear's Prosperous Wheat Fields, of course in reference to a channel member. With our new technocratic distribution of power, I created a new government composed of the industrialists, Karl Lueger's Petit Bourgeoisie, and the army. This government has the money, the people, and the military. What more could it possibly need? It's even a pretty legitimate government, which is nice to see. For the next law, I'll be passing corporatized unions, which will solidify the corporate state into a proper unification of the classes, and after I pass that, all that's left is the single-party state law. Check out the GDP graph in April of 1894, by the way. We're very close to where we were, but it's been a hard climb back up for sure. Unfortunately, there's a general strike that might trigger soon, and it's not that the effects of it are so bad. I mean, they are pretty bad, but the real shame is that I'll never be able to resolve the journal entry due to its insane requirements of having no states at all with more than like 10% radical laborers or something. You're asking me to essentially just get rid of all radicals in my nation with a request like that. Not gonna happen. Thankfully, the strike will only last, I think it's 2 years, and then there'll never be another one ever again, and the strike bar will just sit there full for the rest of the campaign. Very nice. Pear's Prosperous Wheat Fields hit prosperity in August of 1895, and we can see here in Transdanubia a very profitable wheat farm. Usually, wheat and other farming enterprises can be tough to make truly profitable, but with all this throughput and modern fertilizer technology, we can go pretty far. The prestige wheat will do wonders for our pop standard of living, and maybe even for trade. Wouldn't it be fun to make some poor nation dependent on Pannonian wheat, and then tariff it and ruin their lives? Maybe another day. Oh, and I totally forgot to mention it, but at one point I annexed Serbia and then conquered Montenegro. They were very much minor states, so I didn't really bother to cover it, but by March of 1896, check out these greater Austrian Empire borders. I passed corporatized unions in May that year, and then got to work on state religion. We will make of Austria a Catholic federal state, which might prove upsetting for the Orthodox Christians of Serbia, but otherwise can only really be a positive considering the vast majority of the nation is already Catholic. That law passed easily in May of 1897, and now all that's left is the single-party state. This will be awkward considering I don't have any parties, but let's see what happens. Economically speaking, by this point, the strike is holding me back by a bit, but I'm working on getting electricity and cars going for the empire. Cars are insane, of course, and electricity I normally don't bother with, but I'm making an exception for this run because I can pretty easily just put one down in every state, set it to auto-expand, and then maybe manually drop 10 or 15 more power plants in states that are lagging behind. I want to actually use electricity since I rarely do. We hit £500 million of GDP in November of 1898, and the standard of living is stagnating at around 20, which is pretty good. We'll have to start using labor-saving production methods soon, as the cost of a worker will soon outweigh the cost of some coal or tools. In March of 1899, the single-party state passed, and Karl Lueger was forced to step down in the face of a new rising power among the Austrian gubernatorial powers. Remember the CEO of Paris Prosperous Wheatfields, Valentin Schaff? Well, I hadn't noticed, but he became the leader of the industrialists, and he has the most clout in government, so he's the new chancellor. You thought this was an actual fascist playthrough? You fool. This is yet another multicultural industrialist mega economy, and we're just getting started. Okay, before I move on, I should mention that the actual Standestaat wasn't ethnocentric like the fascism of its German counterpart, so a multicultural Standestaat, which only emphasizes Catholic identity and not necessarily German identity, does actually kind of make sense, but the fact that the Catholic corporate estate has been hijacked by a CEO of a grain company from Hungary is very funny to me. Anyway, let's get to a billion GDP real quick. So I ended up playing for about 9 more years at this point, and I want you to imagine what you'd think a fascist state might look like if it were to undergo a capitalist rebranding. The industrialist chancellor, Herr Schaff, naturally just wants more money. It's easy for him to gain power because, of course, he's the man in charge of Austria's food. That means it's time for laissez-faire economics. Let the entire nation's industry be open for purchase, and let interest rates descend. Herr Schaff has employed a system of food rationing to intimidate his political opponents. Every order of Pannonian patent flour from Paris Prosperous wheat farms will check the name on the invoice. If it's one of the chancellor's enemies, the shipment will mysteriously disappear, and that political opponent might find himself without any food until he accepts an invitation to the chancellor's quarters. Herr Schaff has put in immense effort to buy out all of the suppliers of food in the nation to ensure the system works, and that his influence and profits will grow. Much like the Danube River, which feeds his crops and by extension the Austrian people, Herr Schaff is a force of nature, which can determine whether a year will be good or bad for anyone he deems fit. In May of 1899, the Germans and Austrians for the first time worked together in a war against Sardinia-Piedmont. Sure, the Italians had been prevented from uniting, but that land in Italy has a lot of people and a lot of resources. Austria joined Germany's war to protect Modena in return for the conquest of Piedmont, a very rich capital of industrialization in this area. Naturally, the combined Austrian-German army was an immense weight to bear against a couple Italians and the Spanish crown. War is good for business, as soldiers and horses alike need to eat food, and among their favorites will of course be Pannonian patent flour. Check out the GDP in September that year. The GDP line is nearly vertical. Piedmont capitulated in January of 1900, and with their capitulation has been introduced another state to exploit for the business interests of the corporate state. We started getting the occasional mass migration here and there, which was nice to see, as labor will eventually run out even for a highly populous nation like Austria. Nonetheless, after passing laissez-faire in January of 1901, the trickle of Europeans wasn't quite enough. No, the borders must be opened, but this would prove a step too far for the fascists and the government's opposition. They threatened open rebellion, starvation be damned, if just anyone from anywhere would be welcome in this proper Catholic nation. Herr Schaff made a compromise with them. Very well. Everyone that comes to Austria, even if just to work or as a tourist, you name it, they must go to church on Sunday and allow the priest to explain to them the wondrous love of Christ. He said it with a roll of his eyes, but the fascists were quite pleased with that. If the unity of the nation can be maintained, then what's the harm in more people? An Austrian is a Catholic, loyal to the state, and a hard worker. 2 of those things are important to Herr Schaff, and the other is inconsequential. And so, migration controls to Austria would be lifted soon, but not before the foundation of a new company in May of 1901. The rise of a new oil baron, in the form of the Galician Carpathian Petroleum Company, will see a revolutionary new wave of industry come to Austria. I renamed the company to Arboreous Carpathian Oil Corporation, naturally, after a channel member. Thanks to our high literacy and the advanced research power block mandate, we are flying through the advanced technologies of the game, and conveyors will certainly be useful for making demands for oil and saving on labor. But the real prize is compression ignition with its new production method for mines. It will make demand for oil, of which there is plenty in the nation, and it will make all the mines more efficient. Compression ignition is seriously one of the most insane techs in the game, and I always get excited in unlocking it. Oh, and in case you're wondering about the political makeup of the Standestaat right now, here's the clout numbers as of January of 1902. Herr Schaff completely dominates the nation, although he's unfortunately just a moderate, so there's not really any cool ideology to point to. He's a true capitalist, seeking only money, and he's willing to compromise with the fascists to do it. By this point, there's only one good holding the market back, and that's rubber. For now, Austrian traders have been importing it from Africa, at a huge profit by the way, but it's time to secure a local source. Herr Schaff is not a warmonger, so he won't pursue some kind of great war for resources against the great powers. Instead, he'll be invading Burma, which has, up to now, maintained its independence in the face of encroaching European influence. Burma has rubber, it has oil, it has lumber, it has lots of stuff which will be of great use to the economy, and so, the fascist paramilitaries who had been itching for war anyway, prepared to sail overseas and conquer the Burmese people. Before that though, check out the mass migrations we're getting in June of 1902. We've got all kinds of people arriving, and the moment they enter the nation, they'll be handed a leaflet explaining that Jesus loves them, followed by a pamphlet of industries looking for new hires. Anyway, the army landed in Burma in January of 1903, and of course very quickly occupied the whole nation. The war continued, spilling into Manipur, but of course that's far too easy of a war to even think about. Instead, let's look at the population graphs. You see that uptick? That's just mass migrations pouring in. Checking in on our states, we can see Filipino, Luri, Marathi, Greek, Bengali, and Persian migrants all looking for a better life, and very much so finding it out here in Austria. Despite Valentin Schaaf's recent victories, he still needed more labor, and so once again angered the fascists with his proposal that women be given the vote and be able to work. Naturally, the Catholic fascists couldn't stand this corruption of morality in their midst, but this time, Herr Schaaf needed the labor, and the machines of the new age were easy enough to operate for even a woman, so he told the fascists that on this matter, there will be no compromise. Half the population is forbidden from working, that cannot remain. Check out Bohemia as of February of 1904, by the way. Almost 50,000 new migrants arriving every week. Here's a list of the most profitable companies from June of that year. We can see all Austrian companies occupying the top ranks, although Herr Schaaf's very own company, Paris Prosperous Wheatfields, are not so high up. It's difficult to really make even £500,000 on grain, so really you should be impressed it's up there at all. In December of 1904, women were granted the right to vote, and with the right to work, suddenly the labor pool has massively increased, and so the rush for £1 billion of GDP continues. Around October of 1905, while working on a colonial exploitation law, the secrets of compression ignition were finally known to the Austrian world, and with it came an immense increase in productivity across the nation. The diesel pump and its power to extract ore from the earth would see oil's price skyrocket, and the pockets of the oil barons and mining bosses of Austria filled to the brim. I would talk about Herr Schaaf's excitement at the prospect for his nation. However, he actually didn't live to see it happen. It was shortly after passing women's suffrage that he passed away back in December of 1904. His death wasn't particularly mourned nor celebrated, as he had lived his life with only one love: money. The fascists hoped to get someone in power to favor their interests, but the power vacuum left behind by the dead grain magnate was quickly filled by Ludwig von Bohm-Ermoli, a cautious interventionist, and CEO of Maschinenfabriksgesellschaft von Sulfi, which makes sense considering how profitable that company has been. It's quite likely that a roundtable of CEOs will simply revolve their position as chancellor as each one eventually passes away, and Austria's future will be one of a nation defined by its dedication to hard work, profit, and Catholicism. We hit $1 billion GDP in November of 1906, and with that, I played on for 2 more years before calling it a game. As we finish up here, let me just say that I thoroughly enjoyed this campaign, and that with the new patch and DLC, Austria is a great joy to play. You can take them down so many different paths, and each one feels substantially different to the other. The fascist path was one where I was thinking of swapping over to ethnostate and really lording my German supremacy over the minorities of the nation, but it was also fun to center the game on the Catholic identity of Austria and just enjoy some huge economy building by the end. I could have continued the game maybe by 1908 when I finished up, but things were pretty laggy, and it just was kind of tiring. I had achieved what I set out to do, and that was to create a fascist Austrian state, albeit this one lacked that German supremacism you'd think was emblematic of it, but in reality, the Standestaat was not particularly German supremacist. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe got some inspiration to do an Austria campaign of your own. Huge thanks to the channel members whose names you may have seen throughout the video, thanks to their roles as the names of companies. If you want your name on a company, become a member. Thank you for your time.